Hello, I'm Josh, and I am so grateful that you are spending some of your valuable time with me as I talk about a book called Estoril, written by Dejan Tiago-Stanković. This is a book that was actually given to me as a gift. One of my Patreon supporters, who lives all the way in Eastern Europe, decided that he would send me this book because it is one of his favorite books. And I was so touched, although at the same time, I don't know if you're like this, but I'm always a little bit nervous about receiving books as gifts. And that's because I spend a lot of time researching my TBR to decide exactly which books I should be reading based on my own tastes and trying to find the ones that are going to be a hit for me personally. And reading a book for me takes a fair bit of time. I only read 16 books last year, so I do like to really focus on the books that are the highest priority in my TBR. And when you get a book from somebody, it's kind of a wild card, especially if you know nothing at all about it. And then, of course, you're always nervous, like, what if I don't like it? What if somebody's given me this book, they've taken the time to have it shipped to me, and it doesn't really land with me? What do I do then? But on the other hand, there's excitement in receiving something that you know nothing about and just going in there knowing nothing at all and just seeing what happens. So it's also a very exciting thing to happen. In any event, I'm very, very grateful to this person who took the time to gift this to me, and I'm just kind of blown away that somebody would do that for me. So my thanks to you, dear friend, and let's get into what I actually thought about Estoril. So Estoril is a historical fiction work. It takes place primarily at the Hotel Palacio Estoril, which is a hotel that still exists just outside of Lisbon, Portugal, and it takes place throughout the course of the Second World War. So the book opens as war is breaking out in Europe, and then at the end of the book we have also reached the end of the war in Europe as well. So roughly a period of 6 to 7 years passes throughout the course of this book. Under the title here we have kind of this little blurb that says, "A grand hotel, spies, ex-kings, refugees, and a small boy." I'm not going to tell you too much about the plot. First of all, I don't really like spoiling things. I don't like talking about plot in general because it's generally best to start into a book knowing as little about it, I think. And then secondly, there wasn't much of a plot per se in this book. It was very much a character-driven story, and I'll get into that in a second. But what we have is a story that takes place, as I said, in Portugal, which, for all of my interest in history and all of the reading I've done about the Second World War, I didn't realize that Portugal had remained a neutral country throughout the Second World War. As a result, we have characters coming into this story from sort of both sides of the conflict. We have Brits and Americans and others from the Allied side, and we even have Nazi Germans that are kind of coming into the story here because they are on neutral territory. And the setting of the book primarily is this very, very high-end hotel. I get the impression that it's kind of the premier hotel in the Lisbon area for all the rich and swanky folks, because the people that are coming here are often the actual kings and leaders of countries who are fleeing their countries during this time of conflict and war. So the types of people that are coming through the story at this hotel are very much the kind of upper crust, the powerful, the wealthy, the people who can A, afford to flee their country during this time of war, and B, afford to actually stay at the hotel are the ones we tend to meet here. However, the main character is this Jewish boy who is about 10 years old at the start of the book, and we see much of the story through this child's eyes. Now, typically, I'm not a fan very much of books that center around children, but this particular character here is one that was different. He definitely was not your average child. He was a very, very intelligent, very curious, very interesting character. So I was not put off by the fact that we're following a 10-year-old for much of the story here. And really, there were a lot of characters that were kind of coming and going throughout the book, so it definitely wasn't focused just on him either. So really, in a nutshell, the plot is really about the hotel, the staff and guests at the hotel that are trying to get through this war without participating in it because they are in a neutral country. And I'll get to sort of themes in a bit, but like I said, the plot itself, there wasn't really a main overarching storyline. We more got sort of glimpses and stories of people as they came to the hotel and then left, and then new characters would come in and they would leave. And there were a few characters that we did follow consistently throughout the entire story, but much of it was just the comings and goings and the brief period of time that people spent at the Hotel Estoril. Now, I really liked the writing style of the book. It was fairly straightforward prose, but also kind of nicely written at the same time. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. So one example here that I thought was quite nicely written was when they were talking about silence. And you think of silence as being the absence of sound, and there's not much else to it, but the author here talks about different types of silence. One of the characters is speaking and says, "Over there in the Sahara, everything is different. Even the silence is different. And it's never the same. There is the silence of peace, when the tribes are reconciled, when the evening once more brings its coolness, and it seems as if one had furled the sails and taken up moorings in a quiet harbor. There is the silence of the noon, when the sun suspends all thought and movement. There is a false silence when the north wind has dropped, and the appearance of insects, drawn away like pollen from their inner oasis, announces the eastern storm, carrier of sand. There is a silence of intrigue when one knows that a distant tribe is brooding. There is a silence of mystery when the Arabs join up in their intricate cabals. There is a tense silence when the messenger is slow to return. A sharp silence when, at night, you hold your breath to listen. A melancholic silence when you remember those you love." So I thought that was really beautifully written. And in the midst of this sort of nice description and whatnot, there's also some humor sprinkled around. And one thing that made me chuckle was this description of people arguing over a soccer match. It says, "Before dinner, the men kidded around and teased each other about their respective teams. But as soon as the food was on the table, they agreed that the ball was round and tucked into their sardines and rye bread." I thought that was a funny way of stating that they stopped their arguing. They agreed that the ball was round and got on with their dinner. This little snippet here made me chuckle as well. Written, as it was, from a writer, and one of the characters says, "I don't know what Ducic told you, but I do know that one should never trust writers. They are all liars by trade." Now, another interesting technique that the author uses is, every so often, just a few times in the book, the author sort of breaks that third wall, steps out of his story, and talks directly to the reader. So here's a couple of examples of that. The author begins one chapter in this way. "And what if, after almost 3 years, in the course of a number of highly unusual events in a very special place and time, we encounter a perfectly ordinary love story about requited love? Usually such stories are boring, and in honesty, we would not be missing much if we skipped over it. On the other hand, can and should one keep quiet about something as important and human as when your protagonist falls in love like a schoolboy? In order for a love story to be interesting, it has to have something just a little bit special about it. Let's say that what makes this one unusual is that Dusko had been staring at her for over an hour without her noticing because she was standing under the dark stage lights and he was sitting in the audience in the dark." And then here's another example. The author is narrating here and says, "Ivan stopped reaching for his pistol and completed his slow-motion pirouette. It seems that we will not see a single bullet fired in our wartime novel." And then it continues on with the next character speaking there. And then the final example of this brings up another point, which is that, as I mentioned, characters kind of come and go, and we sort of follow individual storylines for a brief period of time before that character departs the story and a new one comes in. And even right towards the very end of the book, we still had new characters arriving, and we might have a chapter or two right almost at the very end of the book where something completely new comes in and happens, and then we go on to the next bit to finish up the book. So the author even comments about this, saying, "Just when you think that the story is coming to an end, that it's time to tie up all the loose ends, a new character appears in our novel when we least expect it. Sarah. Who now is Sarah?" And then it goes on to explain who Sarah is. So I really enjoyed the writing style of Estoril. I thought that it was well written, it was humorous, it was interesting, and it kept me engaged throughout the story. Like I said, the story takes place throughout the Second World War. It starts, I think, in about 1938 or thereabouts, and here's one little interesting bit that places us in that time period and shows that we're in an era prior to the internet and prior even to television, because here's what it says about a specific town here. "Black cabs lined up in front of the theater, and across the way long lines of people stood waiting in front of the phone booths. The only traffic light in the city was to be found here, and people would gather to watch the light change." There's entertainment for you. Ooh, a traffic light. Let's watch the colors change. I'll get more into the setting when I talk about the themes of the story in a minute here. But like I mentioned, it's very much a character-driven story, and there are some very interesting characters in it. For example, in this scene, we have an adult male who obviously has no experience with kids because he's trying to cheer up our 10-year-old boy here in this manner. Our adult man says, and you're not in a very good mood today, you say. Let's see what we can do about that. You don't drink beer yet, do you?" "No." "Oh, of course not. That's what I thought. You're still too young. And you're not into chicks?" Dusko had his own style of communication. "Excuse me?" The boy hadn't understood him. So he's trying to cheer up this 10-year-old boy with booze and women. And then he also teaches the boy this little tidbit about language, which I happen to agree with. This is just a couple of pages later where he's still trying to cheer up the young lad, and he says, "Let's go down to the beach while the sun is still out. You can have an ice cream and I'll grab a beer. You can bring along the puppy, Fennec, or would you like to go in my car? It's fucking good fun." "You just said a bad word," the boy smiled. "You mean fucking? Fucking isn't a bad word. Quite the opposite. It's a very good word, like life or fun. You'll see one day. Other words are bad. Poverty, war, death, those are bad words." I thought that was true and amusing. Later on, we have a couple of men hanging out in the bar at the hotel. Here we have a plainclothes sort of chief of police hanging out with one of the hotel staff who's in uniform, and it says, "The civilian in uniform and the policeman in civvies sit together at the tail end of the bar, where they have a good view of the room and can make a quick exit. They usually each have a drink, just one, because neither employer allows alcohol on the job." So yeah, I guess if you're not allowed to drink alcohol, you should definitely leave it to 1 or 2 drinks. And then finally, before I conclude about the themes, this lady's observation was kind of funny. This lady says, "It's not good for a man to be so handsome. He'll turn out to be a sissy." All I can say there is, I'm not a sissy. Just before I dive into the themes of the book here, I want to take a second to thank my Patreon supporters, especially to my higher tier supporters, Joanna, Osmondus, Paul, and Mojo. All of you really floor me with your generosity, and it is so appreciated. I can't thank you enough. Now, I have to admit that throughout much of the book, I was sitting there going, what's this book really about? And I'm still not entirely sure, but if I had to take a guess, I would say that, especially as the book reaches its ending, it seems clear to me that there are statements being made about being a neutral party during this war against Hitler and the Nazis. Like I said, we are following the wealthy and powerful who had the means to flee the war, and we are in a country of neutrality where you can see that even the employees of this hotel are really bending over backwards to not offend anybody. They don't want to offend any of the Allies. They don't want to offend any of the Nazis that are coming through. And they just want to pretend that nothing is happening, everything's happy in their little bubble, and they do not want to get involved. And again, I'm not entirely sure, but it seems like there's a hint of condemnation from the author towards this country that wanted to pretend that nothing was happening, that did not want to fight against the evil of Hitler and the Nazis, that just wanted to try to pretend everything was okay and there was nothing to worry about. So we see this little example here where it's 1941, Europe is neck deep in this war, things are not going particularly well for the Allied nations, and we have this Portuguese newspaper where it says the news of the day is, quote, a thrilling football duel, end quote. Then comes the headline splashed in bold letters across the whole page: Spain beats Portugal 5-1, and the subtitle, Spanish team better, Portugal not up to expectations. Apart from that, there's not a single other news item on the front page of today's 16th of March 1941 edition of the weekly Diário de Lisboa. All 4 columns are devoted to the friendly game played in Bilbao the day before. So we see this newspaper talking about everything except for this giant war that's happening all over the world. And we see throughout the entire book that this hotel staff want nobody to mention the war. Have you ever seen Faulty Towers? Don't talk about the war. Just popped into my head for some reason. But the worst of it really is at the end of the book, which is also the end of the war, where even with the Allied victory, the Portuguese are so determined to just stay out of it. And we have a couple of examples here. Even on Victory in Europe Day, we have this. It says, the situation in Estoril on Victory Day was calm. Cardoso, who was that police chief, was on full alert, but there was only one isolated incident, and that was when a young man, a shoemaker's apprentice, got drunk and started shouting slogans in support of Soviet Russia and Comrade Stalin. He was immediately arrested and spent the night in jail, where he was slapped around, told that the Bolsheviks eat children for breakfast, and eventually sent back to his parents to be re-educated. He was just 15 and a half years old. So they beat the crap out of this 15-year-old kid just for shouting stuff. We see during these end-of-war celebrations that the police are very much on high alert, even in neutral Portugal here. And again, this is during the end-of-war celebrations. It says, words like anarchism, liberalism, extremists, mercenaries were being bandied around in police circles like swear words. It was being said that unless the popular mood of celebration was carefully channeled, things could turn ugly. Plainclothes agents milling in the crowds did their job more zealously than ever. They took down the names of anyone inciting unrest and disobedience. The arrest lists included intellectuals, workers, artisans, some already known to the police, others not. I tell you what, there's nothing more threatening to the government than an intellectual. Somebody who actually thinks about the situation and goes, wait a minute, what are we doing with our leaders? And on that topic, here's another example. The inspector took the opportunity to repeat his anecdote about the Spanish general who told him, quote, as soon as I hear the word intellectual, I reach for my pistol, end quote. That's right, our governments and leaders want nothing but a bunch of dumb sheep following them, even during these times of amazing joy and celebration. But this final quote I'm going to read, I think hits the nail on the head in terms of theming in Estoril here. And here's what it says. We have our police superintendent, Cardoso again, talking to the head manager of the hotel, a man named Mr. Black. And it says, it was not until several days later, when things had calmed down, that everyday life had resumed. That Superintendent Cardoso, dressed more formally than usual, appeared again at the hotel. He brought a good bottle of wine with him. Well, Black, the war is over. I've come to congratulate you on victory, both as an American, but also personally, he said, and kept shaking his hand. For me, you, sir, are personally one of the winners in this war. What are you saying? Said Black, managing to retrieve his hand from Cardoso's steely grip. "It's true, you are. For the last 5 years, you've been raking in the money like never before," he laughed. "I think that you have more reason than ever to treat me to lunch today." So there you go. We have this theme of the real winners of the war being those who profited financially from it. And certainly this hotel had great success with all of the wealthy and powerful who were fleeing to the hotel and spending time there and spending their money, and successfully avoiding all the horrible aspects of the war. So whether or not it was the author's intent, I feel like it was an interesting commentary on neutrality in the face of a battle against pure evil. And that's what I took away from this very interesting book. I really enjoyed my reading experience. In terms of a rating, I think I would go with about a 7.5 out of 10. It was very well written. It had fascinating characters. And for all the reading I've done about the Second World War, I've never really spent much time thinking about the neutral countries and their experiences in the war. So yeah, it was a very interesting new experience for me. So again, I want to thank the lovely friend who sent this book to me. And from you, I would just love to hear what you've been reading as we start off the year in 2022. What books are you diving into as we start the new year? Thanks for watching. The preceding video has been brought to you free of charge by me, Josh. The only thing I ask in return is that you could do one of the following. Give me a thumb up, push the subscribe button, or share the link to this video with somebody who you think would enjoy it. Cheers. In fairly... There is a silence of the moon. There is a silence of the noon. There is a silence... Oh my god. Now, another, the narration, the author's narrating here and says, Ivan stepped, and he's trying to cheer up our young 10 or 11-year-old, or however he old. You don't drink beer yet. And I think that the news of the day is, quote, a thrilling football duel. And all 4 columns are devoted to the friendly game played in Bilbao. All 4 columns, oh my god. Unfortunately, the men were not arrested because nobody was able to identify, whatever.